Welcome, YouTube family. Welcome to Ujima Wednesdays, where we're building a business arts ecosystem, business arts, as well as investment ecosystem for working class community here in Boston, particularly BIPOC. On Wednesday evenings or nights, we typically focus on political and financial education. And today we're continuing our cultural assembly. Ashe Ashe, and where this is the last installment for the month where we're discussing artist political power. And this evening we have two guests that's gonna kind of, I guess, conclude that conversation tonight and invite folks to kind of just I guess, extend a little bit more about how we're thinking about artists, their role in artist ecosystem, and how we can continue supporting, and some of the collective stories about artists and political power as we relate to them. So with that said, we have Oscar Abello Perry from Next City, and we also have Ms. Larry Ossei-Mensah as well. And so I'll go ahead and just open it up for you guys and let you guys go ahead and start. So Oscar, I'm going to get out the way and give you the space and the mic to go ahead first, but welcome.
Thanks, Johnny. And thanks, Nia and Sierra and everyone else at the Boston Ujima Project and all your members for inviting me into your space and sharing this time, and inviting me to share this time with you. So the question was, what is it posed to me, I guess, was, why is it important for media? Why is art and media storytelling important? What kinds of impact does it have on the world? And there are two things, I guess, two things I guess I want to say here to start out. My perspective as a journalist. These are things that I think about when I when I'm pitching stories, writing stories, editing stories, deciding what stories to write and why I want to write them or not write them. And there's sort of an immediate thing, and then there's a much longer historical thing. So the immediate thing I think about when it comes to journalists and storytelling is, policymakers and other powerful folks like bankers, for instance, they use stories to justify decisions. So, simple example that I think would be familiar to a lot of folks here is, the welfare queen. And that's a story, that's a narrative. It doesn't necessarily have to have a basis in reality, but it becomes a story that media and also policymakers use to justify, for instance, the decimation of the social safety net starting in the 1980s and going all the way through to the 90s, right? This welfare queen idea. Another maybe familiar narrative or story that's out there that influences policy is, in journalism, especially TV journalism, there's this phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, right? If somebody got killed, somebody got their house broken into, got stabbed or whatever, that's going to be the first thing that the 11 o'clock news talks about, or the 5 o'clock news talks about for that evening or that night. If it bleeds, it leads. Like, that's a thing. Sadly, that's a status quo thing, like in media, right? That's a story, and that gets used to justify more police. Gets used to justify the policies that lead to the prison industrial complex, right? If you go back even further in history, you have other images of Black folks, brown folks, the jigaboo or the Jezebel or the Manny or the wetback or the chink, for various epithets thrown at people of color, immigrants all throughout history. They're not just words or images; they're entire narratives that get attached to them, and then policies that get attached to those narratives, get justified to those narratives. Even for indigenous communities, calling them savages and uncivilized, and this was all used to justify their genocide. And it's really interesting because if you look at the earliest descriptions of Indians or Native Americans in the U.S., the descriptions written in journals of the people who the first colonists who came here from Europe, who landed in the Boston area or in Virginia, those first early descriptions of Native Americans were like, wow, these people they're so fit and their skin is so shiny and their hair is so creative, and we don't understand like how they're so healthy looking. Those were some of the earliest descriptions of the Native Americans, or the people who came to be called Native Americans, in the journals of the first colonists settlers from Europe. It would be later when it came time to justify the genocide that the other narratives about those same people would emerge and become used to justify that. Community bankers in general will also use narratives to justify decisions. They'll use narratives to justify, why am I going to give this a loan? Why am I going to give this loan to this business? Yes or no. They're going to use narratives. It's not just the presence of narratives, it's also the absence of narratives. A lot of times a white community banker will encounter a Black-owned business walking in looking for a loan, and it's the lack of narrative. That community banker doesn't know the stories about that person's neighborhood that would give them confidence to make that loan. We call it, sometimes there's a phrase that gets thrown around, character-based lending. It's not just the character of the borrower, the potential borrower, it's the character of the banker. Like the banker also has a character that is a factor in that story. And it doesn't just get used to, the story doesn't just stay between the banker and the potential borrower. So, there are ways that bankers can take the stories that they know from their neighborhood or their community, and they can justify that loan to their CEO, and then they can justify that loan to the regulators. And that's how small business lending has happened for decades in the U.S. Regulators would complain, but the small business banker or the CEO of the bank, if they know the community, if they know the neighborhood, they're able to push back and tell the regulators, no, we got this. This loan is not that risky. If those stories aren't there in the back of the minds or the front of the minds of the bankers about other communities, then they can't make those loans. And so that that's one way that stories get used to justify the allocation of capital. I don't know if anyone likes watching Shark Tank, but yes, actually sometimes I like to watch Shark Tank. It's more of a hate watching thing, but it's also to kind of justify to myself, or just learn about, or affirm the idea that, so entrepreneur comes onto the show, they tell a story, and they get a loan, and they get an investment, or they don't get an investment. That is how trillions of dollars in capital in this country get allocated. It's all storytelling. It eventually gets to relationships, but it starts with storytelling. You tell your story. 2 minutes, you get your pitch, and you get asked some questions. And sometimes the first question that the investors will ask the person giving the pitch is, "Tell me your story. You told me about this, but tell me about you." And so stories get used in the allocation of capital. Stories get used in the determination of policies, whether it's cutting welfare or supporting welfare. A lot of the welfare, a lot of the social safety net that we do have in this country, or had in this country, came about because of the Great Depression and all the stories that got told about what was happening to folks when 25% of people across the entire country of every race, worse in Black communities, worse in Indigenous communities, when people couldn't find jobs, and all those stories got circulated around the media, and we create social security out of that. You create the Works Progress Administration out of that. The stories get used to justify these policies. So that's like the immediate thing, right? Another immediate thing is appraisers and real estate brokers, right? So there was actually a panel discussion I attended earlier today about racism in the appraisal industry, and the fact that if you are a Black person selling a home in a Black neighborhood, you get an appraisal, you agree to a price to sell your home. The buyer will get an appraisal and lower the price that they ultimately paid for your home. If you are a Black or Latino person trying to buy a home in a white neighborhood, and you agree to a price, the buyer in the white neighborhood gets an appraisal and they lower the price. So now you're paying what your home is worth less because you're Black or Latino, basically, is what the studies were saying. Okay, so why does that happen? It happens because the same thing. Appraisers, that's a whole industry of people that have stories that they grow up with, that they're surrounded by. They hear it from the media, they hear it from artists, they hear it from movie makers, writers, playwrights. These are all stories that get fused and filtered into the minds of people who have power over the allocation of capital. And as a result of whose stories disproportionately reach those people, we see what we have today in terms of wealth inequality and racial disparities in the housing markets. The second thing, and I have less to say about this because it's more of it's a talking point among journalists. It's a talking point. If you go to journalism school, this is something you'll hear. If you go to the museum in Washington D.C., and it's the museum about it's the museum about the history of media and journalism in the U.S. You hear this line. The line goes, journalism, news is the first rough draft of history. Everything that we write, not everything, but the things we write as journalists and publish, eventually historians, academics will use that in the work that they do, and that eventually gets turned into textbooks. And if you're looking at the textbooks that we have today, and you're wondering where's the rest of the story, you can pretty much trace it back to like who has had access to most of the press, who has had power and control over what stories get published, what gets documented. That eventually all gets into the textbooks eventually. And so generations from now, so I'm thinking about this when I'm writing, like generations from now, or even one generation from now, will those folks have access to the history about the Boston Ujima project, which I've been writing about since 2016? Will they have access to East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, which I've been writing about? Will they have access to the community art stabilization? Stories about what they've done, histories about what they've done, putting it into context. All that is part of why journalism and media and storytelling are so important from my perspective. So I think I'll stop there and cede the room to Larry.
Thank you so much, Oscar.
Thank you, Oscar. That was great. Am I able to share my screen?
I will give you access now.
Yeah, and I'm going to run through some slides really quickly, and I think building on what Oscar was talking about. When I think about storytelling, I want to share a little bit of my story and who I am, because I think that helps contextualize how I see the world and the work that I do. But then I'm also thinking about frameworks, right? So thinking about tools that I've developed over the last 10, 15 years to help me navigate the world, help me run a nonprofit, help me collaborate. And hopefully these tools will be useful on an individual level, but then I think also collectively in the work that y'all are doing. So I'm gonna share my screen, start the broadcast. Let's see if this works. Okay, you can see my screen, okay. All right, so lead with the hustle. That's what I've been known for. Been curate. Well, let me start. 10 things that I think require zero talent. I always like to start with this because I think sometimes people believe that you need some type of superpower to be successful or be able to get access to particular resources or whatever the case may be. But like things like this, I think are fundamental and helpful. So I think being on time, making an effort, being high energy, I think that builds on what Oscar is talking about in terms of sometimes these preconceived notions about particular communities. And I feel like, at least in my career, these have been able to function as tools to kind of mitigate any type of like potential bias in certain situations, be passionate, body language, coachable, do extra, which unfortunately we have to do as Black and brown folks, but and be prepared and have strong work ethic. And the other thing that's important, I don't know the full makeup of everybody in the group, but if you are creative, if you are an artist, it's important that we think outside the box, because I think that is our largest weapon, is that we can take what's happening in the world, think about it abstractly, and then use that as a way to create, you know, not only cultural expression, commerce, community, but then also a device that we can use as a collective action to, you know, make the world better for ourselves and our families. And then I'm not going to go through all of these toolboxes. I'm going to focus on 4 of them. But as I mentioned before, frameworks and platforms I think are important in terms of like how you move through the world, regardless of what it is you do. Artistic practice, I think that's relative to whether you're an artist, accountant, cultural worker, storytelling. I think showing up is important, investing in yourself, and, you know, being professional. But I'll focus on 4 of these things. So I'll quickly share my story. Larry Ossei-Mensah, I'm a curator, self-taught, born in Harlem, raised in the Bronx, first generation Ghanaian American. My journey in art started when I was 27. And my grad school, I was living in Switzerland studying marketing. My background is in business management, marketing, hospitality, and I just caught the art bug through photography. And for me, that was an opportunity for me to tell my stories. So you can see on the left, you know, documenting portraits of people in my community, and just showing how I see the world, how I process. And that's evolved into this, you know, curatorial practice that really now works in collaboration with artists to tell their stories around different issues that they find important through the work that they do. I've also written about artists coming into the arts. I didn't necessarily fit the pedigree to write for the art forums of the world. So what I did is I wrote for cultural magazines like Essence, Arise Magazine, Uptown Magazine, did some stuff for BET, because I realized that, you know, if the, I guess, mass media is not going to provide an opportunity for me to tell the stories of my community, let me go to my community and tell the stories, you know, let's tell our stories to each other. How do we make the arts, the visual arts, important part of the conversation as much as we do music, as much as we do cinema. And then I hit a crossroads and had to make some choices in terms of like, what did I want my contribution to be? So starting out in photography, then writing, and I just noticed that there was a need for more forums to be created for artists to share their work, for us to have conversations around some of the issues that we're talking about now, and really just kind of took the deeper dive into curating as my vocation. And so one thing that I think is important for everyone to do, regardless of your vocation, I call it guiding principle. Some people call it the manifesto, but I think having you know, these pillars that kind of guide your decision making, because I think for me, it's helped me really identify what are the things I really want to work on, what are the things that are important, and it creates a personal checks and balance. So for me, that's access, belonging, curiosity and conversation, value, being a catalyst for diversity and collaboration. And so access for me, as someone who grew up in the South Bronx, I didn't grow up going to museums. And so always thinking about when I create an exhibition or an experience, what will be something that will be inaccessible to a 16-year-old me, right? And so thinking about that in the work that we do, access to information about grants, you know, access to information about workshops. How are we thinking about that in the daily work and making sure that everybody's able to benefit from the resources that are available, creating a sense of belonging, community. That's fundamental to what I do, particularly working with young people, to remind them constantly that the arts is for them. These creative expressions is for them, and working with them in tandem as collaborators. Curiosity and conversation, as someone who's self-taught, that's how I learn, but then also creating these forums for conversations and juxtapositions that, you know, you may not normally see on a day-to-day basis. So for example, Joan Jonas and Jason Moran, they've been collaborating for over, I think, 12, 13 years. and what can we learn in terms of this intergenerational, intercultural. You have a musician, visual artist, and so always trying to use my practice as a forum to kind of create these tensions and these dialogues. And, creating a sense of value. I think, what Oscar outlined is that there are a lot of structural things put in place to make us feel devalued. And so what can we do with the tools that are at our fingertips to create that value for young people, seniors, and other communities that may not necessarily feel welcome, valued, seen. And that's really been fundamental to what drives my practice. Catalyst for diversity. And when I'm thinking about diversity, I'm thinking about social economics, I'm thinking about culture, I'm thinking about class, and how do you use the forums at your disposal to catalyze these conversations and create these spaces. And collaboration. I think what this organization represents is a true example of like, how do we collaborate? How do we work together as thought partners to solve a lot of the issues that are impacting our communities? And take advantage of the resources that are available, but also I think really work to create our own table, right? Because I think a lot of times there is this desire to get a seat at the table. But for me, I'm interested in what does it look like to create your own table that's equitable, a table that is really taking into consideration the multitudes that encompass our communities and really trying to move forward together. And so going back to this toolbox, I look at it as a rule of engagement. And so thinking about individually, what are the platforms that you use to do your day-to-day work? So whether you're a journalist, whether you are a cultural worker, whether you are a accountant. And for me, that was work that I had to do to kind of identify that obviously as a curator, exhibitions, public programming, social media, now moving into Web3 and metaverse and publications as different devices. And so I invite everyone to think about what are the platforms that they're using in their day-to-day work to really think about how we can move together as a community, how we can tell better stories individually and collectively. And so for me, exhibition making is a form of storytelling. I just recently co-curated the Athens Biennale in Greece, which is on view now, called Eclipse. And Tamashi, who's in the audience, is one of our collaborators and participants. And for me, one thing that's interesting is that I believe I'm the first Black curator to work on this exhibition. And so really thinking about how do we tell the stories of the diaspora in a way that is nuanced, layered, and really kind of considering the variety of ways that artists from the diaspora articulate ideas and express themselves. So from what I know, looking at the numbers, it's about 40% of the artists, or over 82 artists participating, represented at diaspora in some shape or form. And so for me, exhibition making has been a vital tool in telling our stories and creating a forum for artists of color to really share what they're thinking about, share what's important, and then really create important dialogues in spaces where there might not necessarily be a deep familiarity with how we express, work, create, share. And then I think public programming, social media, for me, it's a device, it's a tool. And so thinking about, Instagram, how is that a tool for research, but then also a tool for disseminating information? Clubhouse has become a great tool for learning over the last year. But then again, thinking about this metaverse, this Web3, crypto, NFTs, DAOs, how can Black and brown folks be part of the building of this? Because this is what's going to be the next chapter. And I think a lot of times people hear, NFTs, for example, and they're either like, what's that? Or they become very dismissive of it. When on the other end, there are people who are putting a lot of money and resources into really kind of pushing this forward. I mean, if you think about Facebook is rebranding their whole company to be a metaverse company. So what are the resources and tools available to us to be part of it, but then also create these microeconomies where Black and brown folks, working class folks can benefit and support each other. And this is an image of a collaboration I did with Derek Adams to commemorate Jay-Z's 25th anniversary of Reasonable Doubt. So a lot of opportunities, it's a lot of information, but I think it's something that we really need to take a deeper dive into. And I think the more we understand, that allows us to have the resources to tell our stories, not only economically, but I think also technically, and then also collectively. And so that's something that I've really been trying to do a deep dive on the last couple of months. Publishing, so obviously creating books, catalogs, prints when possible, and artistic practice. So for me, there's a multitude of individuals in here. When I think about artistic practice, I'm not just thinking about artists. I'm thinking about anybody who has a particular vocation and passion. What is your why? You know, why do you do what you do? And then what are the goals that you're setting to make sure that you are doing that at the highest level? How do you keep your fingers on the pulse? So workshops like this as a great example. And then how are you finding inspiration to continue to move forward in whatever it is that you want to do through your day-to-day work? What is your purpose? You know, why do you want to do what you want to do? Whether it be a journalist like Oscar, or be a policymaker, for example. And how are you fulfilling this purpose, and what steps are you taking to execute? And your how, you know, so guiding principles, I talked about mine. I think everybody should have some guiding principles that help them navigate what they do in day-to-day work schedule. And then, you know, how are you challenging yourself in the work that you do on a day-to-day basis? What is your what? You know, so what kind of art are you making if you're an artist? And then also, I think a key thing is determining what's working and not what's not working. So like from a, if we're talking about organizational standpoint, you're applying for all these grants and you're not getting it, you know, are you getting feedback to kind of understand what's not working in your application? Are you putting together, you know, a brain trust of folks who can help you navigate the system? Because like we all know the system is riddled with red tape and bureaucracy, but it takes, you know, kind of collective action to kind of understand where the landmines are in order to navigate that and get the things that you need in order to do the work that it is you want to do. Artist storytelling. I always like to show this. I think, can anybody in the audience guess who this artist is? You can drop it in the chat or vocalize it. Nobody? All right, what about this one? You guys are being shy. This artist? Okay. Well, the example of, go ahead.
Someone offered Basquiat, Yoi, Derek Folger,
Yep.
Fedor.
Let me go back.
That.
Let me slide back. Oh, this is going back. Kusama was correct. The first artist, I'll run through this quickly because I want to be mindful of time. This is Rashid Johnson, Faith Ringgold, and Kusama. And I bring up these artists because they've all built very distinctive vocabularies. You know, I would say a brand is someone who comes from a marketing standpoint. That's a bad word in the arts, but that's what it is. I think they've built something that's recognizable, distinctive. And so I always invite people when we're talking about storytelling, you know, we are all personal brands, and that, and some people frown on that. But I think, you know, Oscar kind of alluded that, you know, people judge a book by its cover, whether it's individually or as a community. And so then what can we do with the tools that are available to us to tell those stories and control the narrative? Because I think that's really what's essential in helping us move forward as a collective, is controlling the narrative, telling our stories, utilizing the tools that, you know, particularly with Black folks who make cool, so like Twitter, like Instagram, like TikTok. These things don't thrive without us. And so how are we using them as, I don't want to say tools for good, but tools that tell a truer story and tell a story on our terms. And so coming from a marketing background, when you're thinking about like a brand, for example, you know, we ask the question, you know, what is your brand, or what problem are you solving, right? So what are you investigating through your practice, whatever your chosen vocation is? You know, what is it about? And what's your position? You know, so I think with Oscar, for example, you know what kind of journalist Oscar is based on the different concerns that they articulated in their presentation, right? So someone who's concerned about the community, concerned about policies that are being put in place to oppress folks. So thinking about where do you lie within whatever you do on a day-to-day, and what are you seeking to express? So what story are you trying to tell through your brand, your identity, who you are as a person, but then also as a collective? And what can people expect, right? Because I think with brands, there's a certain expectation. And so how do you, again, control the narrative and the storytelling so that the expectation that people are having is the one that you want, right? And the other thing that I think is super important, I think, and you are doing this with the workshop, is invest in yourself. I think that's an essential part of like telling your story, right? And is doing the work, honing your craft. So if you're an artist, it's a residency. If you're an accountant, it's maybe taking an extra class, really learning about the business of what you do on the day-to-day. It's not enough to complain about not having the resources available. I think, they hide things in the book, so to speak, in quotes, but so open those books up and see what's there, and see how we can take advantage of the resources that are put, that are made available for us on the day-to-day. And then I'm a believer, leverage your current opportunity into a next opportunity. And again, setting reasonable goals. And this is a actualization tool that I created, if anybody's interested. And it's systematic approaches for everyone. I'm a big believer in goal setting, and really kind of teasing out what are the things that are necessary to achieve those goals. What are the resources? And I think one thing with regard to storytelling is also measurement. How are we measuring success? What are the metrics? So is it getting that grant? Is that building your community? And what are the challenges that come with that? Because I think developing a systematic approach to community building, to storytelling, I think heightens your success rate. To be frank, it doesn't necessarily need to be robotic, but I think it's helpful in terms of just kind of thinking through what are the resources, the avenues, the devices, the tools necessary in order to really make a difference in our community. And I will shut up now. Hopefully I didn't take too much time. How do I unshare? Okay, cool.
Both presentations were brilliant, and appreciate you both. There's a couple of questions that are in the chat. And to start from Tamashi, how do we consider value? How do we consider partnership? How are we valued? And how do we tell stories individually and collectively? You don't have to address it.
Hey y'all, those were just notes. I was just taking notes in the chat from Larry's talk. Rhetorical. Those are rhetorical notes, but I guess that remains open to all of us, really. Thank you both for that. Really, I mean, and also both of you could expound upon that, going back to Oscar. Really fascinated by how you center the importance of storytelling and how we value our community stories of response to governance, like response to how we respond to policies, how we create methods to endure, and whether or not we document those stories for ourselves and retell those stories among ourselves. That really stood out for me with you. So thank you both.
Thank you. Well, Oscar, I'll let you go because I think Tamashi brought up some really good points. Because I think, just one thing, and then Oscar, I'll turn it to you. I think one thing that I've realized in doing this work, and that's why we do the publications, is the importance of archiving, right? Because I think sometimes we're under the impression that what we're dealing with right now is new, right? But that's not true. Like I just did an exhibition with an artist, Amwako Boafo, at MOAD in San Francisco. And that exhibition was inspired by Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folks, written in 1903. And if you read that book and what he's articulating about the Negro life at that time, turn of the century, you're like, oh, this looks like 2021, And I think it's important that, by telling our stories and archiving these stories, it becomes a resource to see how folks were dealing with particular challenges. Hopefully there is improvement and evolution from that. But I think when we're thinking about America, there's just things that are just ingrained in its bloodstream, in its DNA. And then, it's going to be just part of the constant work to create in the journey towards social justice.
Yeah. Let me pick up right from where you left off from there. So W.B. Du Bois, who was many things, right? One of the things he was the editor of The Crisis, a magazine. He was a journalist, right? The articles he wrote in The Crisis about African-American cooperatives in the late 18th or in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he wrote a series of articles, and those articles became the basis of what I think you all have seen in this book, right? Like if you read this book, like she got so much of her work into the research in this book came straight from the work of a journalist, W.B. Du Bois, and the stories he did and others did in The Crisis magazine about cooperatives, African-American cooperatives, right? Sorry, I was holding it up. It was Collective Courage by Jessica Gordon Nembhard. I should make sure I vocalize it and not just hold up the book. But so there's the history, and those magazines, those were archived somewhere, and Jessica found them a couple years ago. I forget how long ago she started on the work, but Jessica Gordon Nembhard eventually compiled that. Yeah, that was the starting point. Then she found much more history and documents that eventually created the book Collective Courage, which is one of the first books I read. I exposed them. One of the first books that I encountered in the cooperative world that kind of drew me through the space. And it made me wonder, like, okay, so like who's writing about this stuff now? And well, eventually someone's going to write that book, 50 years from now, 60, 70 years from now. And I felt compelled to contribute to whatever future work that is. In terms of another way to think about value, and also I see a question from Sierra about how can artists work to return power to themselves. I think Larry, you mentioned leveraging opportunity and leveraging understanding your value as an artist, and like really like seeing that for what it is, and the fact that we may, for the first time in the history of this country, we have more space to move money and wealth around than ever before, and I really mean that genuinely. So I want to show you something. Can I also share my screen? Okay.
Give me just a second, Oscar. I'm doing it right now.
Okay. So this is something I would encourage artists, and not just artists, but others who are looking for resources to kind of keep in mind. At Boston Ujima Project, you're raising capital, you're raising all kinds of support for the work that Boston Ujima wants to do and needs to do. You're also, and there are others around the country who are also, who I've talked to. I'm also sharing this with them. So look, so this is M1. This data is from the Federal Reserve. So we have a line chart, a line graph here. And M1 represents all the money that exists out there in the form of either currency or bank accounts, whatever is in everyone's bank accounts. And this chart goes back to 1959, and there was 139, this is in the billions of dollars. So in February 1959, there was $139 billion out there in currency or bank accounts, checking accounts mostly. Some savings accounts, but mostly checking accounts. $139 billion in 1959. And you can see it grows pretty steadily. It accelerates a little bit in the 90s, but flattens out again until the Great Recession and the financial crisis in 2008. So I won't get into it right now because it's very complicated to explain, but the Federal Reserve changed dramatically in 2008. And you can see it in this chart because you can see the difference in the angle of the way the line goes up much more steeply since 2008. Since August 2008, right around when the crisis kind of started to take hold and the Federal Reserve started to do some things it had never done before in the fall of 2008. And you can see that it almost looks like a mistake, like what happened? Well, I want to explain to, I can explain to you if you want later on, but let me just, but suffice it to say, the Federal Reserve really changed. And so by January 2020, there was $4 trillion in money out there, money supply. That's, again, that's currency and bank accounts, $4 trillion. This is January 2020. So what happened last year? A lot happened last year, right? CARES Act, immense stimulus. Now let me add the rest of this chart, because I stopped this chart in 2020. Let me add the rest of this chart. Yeah, you see, I see some eyebrows going up. Yeah, it looks like a yet another mistake. Like, what the heck happened? Well, a lot happened, and we can, again, if you want to know more about it, I can talk your ear off about it. But suffice it to say, by September of 2021, there was $19.8 trillion out there. It looks like a total mistake, but I'm not kidding you. We are living in a different monetary world from a year ago. It is like in January 2020, there was $4 trillion out there. Now there is $19 trillion out there. So when you are asking for money, whether it's grant money, investment dollars, when you're asking for payment as an artist, definitely know there is more money out there than there ever has been in the history of money in this country, by a long shot, by such a ridiculous long shot, it looks like a mistake, because you're looking at it right now. So think about value and power in terms of that, and the fact that you have, if you have something of value and you feel like you've been undervaluing it, you have probably been undervaluing it, and so has everyone else.
Ask a quick thing, because I know this is an exhaustive answer, and this might even require another session. But I think if you could pinpoint 3 things in terms of like the shift from 20 to now, because obviously the government printed more money for the stimulus to get people to spending. So I guess maybe are there 3 kind of key factors that people should be aware of that kind of triggered the spike? And does this also account for inflation? Because I was reading something the other day that this is debate on whether the inflation is happening or not happening, but they said the reality is Americans like to spend. That's their pastime. And so it kind of like almost mitigates this disinflation that's occurring. Yeah,
hey, Gary?
I'd be curious.
Sorry to interrupt. Oscar.
No, Johnny, let this play out and then we'll end after this.
No, what I was going to say was that should be the last question, and so I just want to make space for you to answer that one, and then we're going to end on that note. Just wanted to offer that.
Great, thank you.
Yes, the things that happened last year were the CARES Act and the stimulus payments that went out, and the Federal Reserve's measures to support the economy, but mostly the financial sector, to get through all this. The Federal Reserve learned how to do some things in 2008. Like I showed you before, it changed in 2008. It learned how to do some things. And last year, it did those things in clearly unprecedented ways. So the CARES Act, including the stimulus payments and the Federal Reserve's interventions in the economy to keep things stable. And actually, when you look, it's hard. When you look at poverty rates, you actually find poverty rates were lower, in part because of the stimulus payments, right? The checks that went out. So a bit of this money did actually end up in the hands of people who needed it most. Most of it did not, but it's out there now. In terms of inflation, yeah, so this is a big thing, and there's a huge fight now because the Federal Reserve used to think, oh, if we put too much money out there, we'll cause inflation, and a lot of people still think that. But what the Federal Reserve learned between 2008 and now is that it really doesn't know what causes inflation. There's theories, and there's people who think they know based on those theories, but we really don't know. And that what you're seeing now is the fight within the Federal Reserve and around the Federal Reserve around, is this going to cause inflation? Because in most countries, if they were to print this much money, it might cause inflation. But in a big country like this that doesn't borrow money in anyone else's currency, like when the U.S. borrows money, it's always in U.S. dollars. And we can talk more about it if you want, but basically, inflation is always a concern, and the Federal Reserve knows that, but they also realize it has been wrong about inflation for many decades now. And what you're looking at is a Federal Reserve that's trying to figure out how to live in a world where we really don't know what causes inflation.
And then last question, and then I'll shut up. How can we ensure, besides valuing, our vocation and what we do, that we grab some of this money and make sure it's cycling in our communities? Because I know one thing that happens is that, the stimulus money comes in and either you save it or you spend it, but it doesn't kind of cycle into our communities, it cycles out. So I guess what are like one or two things that you think are imperative for us to kind of be mindful of to make sure that money is cycling in the community? And then for me, for example, that's why I'm thinking about social tokens and crypto and all this stuff, because it's kind of designed to kind of cycle money into these microeconomies. So I would love to hear your thoughts on like how we could secure the bag, because there's a lot of money out there.
Yeah. I would say it puts the onus on the political organizing and the organizers and the people who are, fighting with tenants and fighting with small businesses and Black-owned businesses, brown-owned businesses. It puts a lot more onus on them to make specific demands that will change the financial system, to bring government support, public support, to institutions and organizations such as Boston Ujima Project, quite frankly, to bring the same federal support that Wall Street gets. What happens if Boston Ujima Project gets that? Because it's just another way of allocating capital that works differently, right? And I would encourage, and it has to be federal support, whether it's Federal Reserve or Congress, changing the way those things work to change the way finance works. Not necessarily because I'm not against NFTs or cryptocurrency or using those things. The thing is, those things as they are even now will always be competing against the Federal Reserve and whoever is latched onto the Federal Reserve. And you can, as you can see here, the Federal Reserve can do things that no other financial institution can do, and it will swamp out anything that the cryptocurrency wants to do that might be different. So what I'm saying is, there's a reason why the last bit of the civil rights movement, right, was focused on the Federal Reserve, like Coretta Scott King, the Full Employment Coalition in the late 70s. They were saying we've got to use this thing to create jobs for everyone, and we mean for everyone. And we have to be able to track that and look at, is it creating, are we using it to its full potential? Because it's the fountain of all money, and even something like cryptocurrencies, it's going to be swamped out by this if you don't include this. Basically what I'm saying is the organizers need to look at how can this interface with Boston Ujima Project or other democratically run, managed, and owned financial institutions. That's really where the ball game is from my perspective.
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Larry. Thought-provoking conversation. And I think it's official. I think this is the start of a conversation versus the close of a conversation. And we just appreciate your brilliance and you all coming out to the space. And the chat is lit up. So thank you both. I'm going to say bye to our YouTube family. Thank you for checking in. Bye for now.